Public engagement and democracy, getting this right in 2021. I would say the current pandemic has arguably exacerbated the digital divide in our society, with many vulnerable groups becoming harder to reach than ever before. In this session, we're going to discuss what we mean by public engagement in 2021 and how this has been impacted by the events of this year. As we continue to spend significant periods of time at home and online, how can technology be used to keep people informed during critical events such as the elections or during public health crises? Finally, what are the key lessons and insights that we can take forward with us in 2021 to ensure that citizens' voices are heard, particularly those that are vulnerable or at risk? So to kick off the conversation, maybe Al, if I start with you, would you mind giving us a bit of an intro about yourself, about Logically, and just briefly, I guess, where you're coming from on this issue, on this topic? Thank you.
Sure, thanks very much. It's a great introduction. So my name's Al, I'm the managing editor at Logically, and Logically is a tech startup. We've been going for a couple of years now. And we try and integrate AI and other kinds of technologies into solving journalistic and media problems. So we do fact checking. We do a lot of work tracking misinformation and conspiracy theories online and try and understand kind of in a sophisticated way how these things work, the impacts they have, and what we can sensibly do to present them. So in terms of the topic of the panel today, I guess the thing that I'm going to be most focused on and interested in and prepared to talk about are questions about how we can encourage people to, or tools that we can give people to make more responsible and efficient and effective use of the information that they have access to. The unprecedented levels of information that they have access to.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you, Al. And how about you, Hira? Where are you coming from on this issue, on this topic?
Thanks. I spent about 7 years of my life working to investigate corruption, looking at open data and public engagement in terms of how do we get citizens and civil society to really influence public policy, especially in the context of government contracts. But at the same time, I was also I started and was running a nonprofit called Chen, which brings me here with a gender lens. So looking at, gender-based violence and how we redistribute power back to survivors who can, live meaningful lives. So, tech has a huge role to play in that, both in terms of a harm enabler and as a way of finding solidarity and community.
Thank you, Hira. That's really interested to unpack some of that in a bit more detail during the hour session we have. And finally, Anne-Marie, can I come on to you? Would you mind telling us a bit about the work that yourself and Future Care Capital have been doing this year? I know particularly around some work you've been doing recently on assessing the mental and physical health among social media users during the pandemic.
Thanks very much, Catherine. It's lovely to be here. Future Care Capital, for those who don't know us, we're a charity operating in the health and social care space, and we have a particular focus on data technology and innovation. We've been around for about 70 years, but this is our latest and current guise. And I guess in terms of the key things I want to pick up that we've done this year, so probably there's 3 or 4 things. So the first is that we undertook a poll back in July with Ipsos Mori to better understand the general public perception of general public's perception of the use of their data in the context of the pandemic and the different technologies that are being used. And in particular, it was interesting there to understand that obviously the government has taken emergency measures and steps to use data for public health purposes. And it was clear that the public was supportive of that, but they also expected that data to be deleted once the emergency ended, which I'm not sure is quite the same view of health professionals and researchers and innovators who think that there is now a real opportunity to do something special if we keep some of the benefits of those emergency provisions as they see them. And there was certainly also a sense that a lot of the technology, including the infamous COVID app, were kind of developed for people who were probably worried well rather than the people that were most at risk. So the people most at risk were the least aware of those technologies or the least trustworthy in them. So I think those things are important here. Some of the work we've been doing is with the National Data Guardian, who are undertaking an incredibly important piece of work around how the public understands public benefit from the use of their health and social care data, and really trying to understand, particularly amongst deprived communities, the extent to which the public understands what different aspects of their data, how it's used, and what that means in terms of potential algorithms and other technologies that kind of flow from them. And then the last couple of things, one is around the Liverpool mass testing pilots that people might have read about in the media recently. I think there's an evaluation due out next week, which I would commend to everybody from the initial pilot. It's clear already, released in the public domain, that there's an issue reaching out to digitally excluded and poorer communities to encourage people to come forward for testing, and they may well be the most at risk. But there's also a sense that I think we often think that we are the ones that wouldn't fall for misinformation or disinformation, that you never think it's you. So I would ask people to consider carefully, do you think you've read something about the efficacy of these massed rapid tests that tells you that they're not as good as the ones that were used from the beginning of early in the pandemic in the UK and around the world? And if you do you know the difference between a good test and a good testing system? Because I'm not sure what we call misinformation and what we call disinformation. So those are the 3 areas for the startup.
Excellent, thank you. Brilliant intros from you all, and lots there that I wanna sort of delve into in more detail. Maybe just to sort of begin with, and Hira, I'll come to you. Obviously, this year we have seen sort of increased public debate, public discussion in areas around all sorts of use of data and technology in decision making. Do you think we have a more informed public around these issues today? And if so, what does this mean for public engagement going forward?
Absolutely have a more informed public. I think there are 2 ways to come at this. One is to think about, the public has, in a way, always expressed when things go wrong because of the important role that journalists and media play, right? So there's a scandal, people react. But I think where we all want to get to is that engagement doesn't only happen when things go wrong, but that the public is involved in co-production of services, of having a critical voice in how these critical public goods are governed. So it's not just when things go bad, but also how we evolve, and how our society sort of changes. I think we're closer to that because, thanks to all the campaigning that has happened by civil society and activists, and just really amazing civic leaders that, the governments are doing consultations, but we know that, all the best intentions, still not everyone has time to engage with government consultations. And maybe that's not the best way, for every single public matter. So I would say that is something we need to kind of get better at. And the second thing is to really, I think we have in some instances, it completely makes sense to go for intermediaries, right? Like nonprofits, research labs, when you're talking about an issue because it's harder to organize and get a good representation of different kind of viewpoints. However, there's a certain risk that, given we know the way power and privilege works in professionalized sectors, we miss out on the real diverse and on the ground opinions of vulnerable groups or minoritized identities. So I think it's important to have a good balanced approach in that. And really involve people, I hate the phrase affected communities, but that's basically what it means, especially those who might get missed in the design process or any legislation or anything like that. And the third thing I would say is, finally, is that we should think about yes, we want the public to engage and the public is engaging, but then what happens? You put so much pressure on getting people to really have their voice heard, have platforms where they can express things. But then it's classic open data problem is when you create an app to help people report potholes, people keep reporting potholes, but then no one fixes the potholes. And what it creates is frustration in people, and potholes is the perfect example, but it kind of rolls over to so many different things. So what happens with that fatigue that we're putting on public where they're engaging, but they're not seeing the response to that. So that is, I think, that is where we need to focus a lot on. Like, what happens when we say what we want or what we need and we collaborate?
Excellent. Al, your thoughts on this? Where are we? Where is the public at the moment?
I mean, I think the public is certainly more aware of some of the kinds of problems that can that can arise in this area than they were before this year. I don't know if we can yet say that the people in general are more informed. I think it's just an awareness of the problem. I think we've still got a long way to go before there's a good understanding. I think even within the sector of like the specific nature of the problems that we've seen. Like this year, I think you were talking about the the COVID app and the exam results fiasco and so on. There's clearly a bigger awareness that there is a problem, but I think even within the sector, there's not quite clear agreement on what the nature of these problems is or how we can address them going forward. The exam results issue in particular I thought was very interesting because it goes to a question, because it kind of raises a question of whether there are certain things which on principle, or certain elements of the public sector which on principle kind of algorithmic decision making should stay away from, or if there's some level of individual impact that that precludes it as being a just way to do any kind of social policy. And I don't think we've even really started having that conversation properly yet. I'd be super interested in hearing what Anne-Marie has to say about that. So I thought your I thought your points about engagement with underrepresented communities were really important, and weighs into that hugely.
Excellent, thank you, Al. Anne-Marie, do you want to pick up any of those points based on what Al just said?
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a fine line between informed and understanding, and then being faced with new information that you've got to somehow assimilate and figure out, is that true, is that not true, to what extent do I kind of subscribe to that? I think the pandemic's been particularly difficult because we've seen a politicisation of public health. It's not that you've just been given facts. You might feel that, I guess, that you sat and consumed more data, more statistics, and certainly more graphs and curves than ever in your life, from a sedentary position in the last few months. The question is, do you believe them? Do you believe because of who the information is coming from or given to you by? I think we do when we listen to Professor Chris Whitty on the Downing Street press conference, potentially. But then in recent months, even that's been brought into question by politicians, who some of whom obviously feel that a lockdown is unjustified and the data doesn't support their position, or there is insufficient or inappropriate information. So I think we've got a really interesting period of time where we've become kind of, the information is not about do you agree to one position or another in an echo chamber, as might have been 4 years ago with the culture wars kicking off in real gusto. Now we've got a culture war that's around numbers and curves and algorithms. Particularly struck about the kind of the mutant algorithm. It's quite interesting. There was an article in the Sunday Times about 6 weeks ago that suggested there'd been a tool developed to decide what happens to you if you phone 911 in the middle of the original 999, in the middle of the kind of original peak of the pandemic. If you were over a certain age and you were a man, I think it was 80, you weren't getting picked up and you weren't going to be helped, was the insinuation of this tool. And it was to triage people in the event that we had insufficient beds or ventilators or staff at the hospitals and it became overwhelmed. It's a really horrible tool to think about. But people didn't talk about it as an algorithm. They talked about it as a risk scoring tool. And it's really interesting that the reaction to that was one of ageism, whereas the reaction to the mutant algorithm was, we don't want to be dictated to by a machine. And yet both of them effectively take numbers and spit out a result. So I think it's quite interesting, just people's perceptions of where we are in that. I don't think we're there yet with understanding.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Hira, I'd like to come back on to you now. I think one question that I'd like to ask you is around, obviously, we've seen public engagement be impacted by all the events of sort of 2020. Would you say that we've seen, especially with a lot of people spending, as I mentioned in the introduction, a lot of people spending more time at home in front of their laptops, not necessarily getting out, being able to engage as much on a lot of these issues, at least maybe just from their keyboards. Have we seen a reduction just more generally in engagement though? And what could this mean for our understanding of some of these key policy areas?
I don't think I have the right information to assess whether we've had a decrease in engagement. However, I would say that given Anne-Marie's point on misinformation and disinformation, I think the more interesting thing for me is to assess whether people spending more time online has resulted in like more spread of both. I think the critical thing here is trust. I did not grow up in this country, so for me, it's super interesting that the reaction I've seen in like Asia has been so different by people kind of trusting the government, not questioning whether masks should be worn, less conspiracy theories, even in countries like Japan, which have like strong anti like vaccination like movements, if you can call them a movement, like these really harmful like beliefs, and the reaction has been so different. So as an observer, I find it really fascinating how you know the response in the UK has been strange. I moved in this pandemic, and I was contracting a lot of sort of construction people and like contractors. I was conversing with all of them about COVID-19, and I was just dumbstruck at how easily people believe, things. And, even though we have Professor Chris Whitty on the news every day, none of the people that I spoke to were tuning into the news. They were just like, oh, this person said this to me, and I read this on WhatsApp. I saw this on Facebook. They were seeing clips. And when we are in a clip, like, when people are sharing clips without the full context, I think that's like really harm. And my husband's a doctor, my brother and my father, my aunt are all in the NHS. So I found it really frustrating having those conversations with people. But it's so important because it tells you, like, again, as Anne-Marie said, you can throw all the graphs at people, but if the trust isn't there in those institutions, they'll be like, oh, well, these are just numbers. I've seen another graph which says something completely different. That's the big.
That's a really important point, and it's something that people who are involved in any kind of communication around like the public health, science, or indeed like any kind of data related field needs to take seriously the fact that, and this isn't a problem, right? We shouldn't expect everybody. I mean, I certainly don't know enough to fully understand every public health graph that I've seen so far, and a big part of my job is trying to make sense of those numbers. But I have to go and ask people who do know. We shouldn't expect the general public to understand the significance of any particular graph. That's the issue. So Anne-Marie mentioned that the culture war is around numbers, and that's true to an extent. But it's the bigger point is that it's not the numbers we disagree on; it's what they is what policy positions they support. Obviously, the one thing that everybody knows about political communication is that either if you throw statistics at people, they will either disregard them if they appear not to support their previous position, or they will like seek out the ones that do. So I think it's been a really communication around in the pandemic has been really peculiar, because precisely because there does seem to have been such a focus on data and numbers. And there's maybe, I mean, if the cynical part of me thinks that maybe it's just that the people who are doing the communicating themselves don't have the time or the resources to fully digest and understand what these things mean, which means that they can't then communicate them effectively to the public. But either way, the impression I've got over the last year has been of a lot of statistics and not nearly enough, not nearly enough meaning, and not nearly enough interpretation being done on behalf of the public.
And Al obviously logically sort of operates in the UK, but also in other countries such as the US as well. Have you seen much of a difference in approach to sort of public engagement sort of across the countries you operate in?
Well, we operate across the US, the UK, and India, and it's not. So yes, but I'm not sure if it's particularly telling given the political differences in the three countries. I don't think it's very easy to directly compare them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's striking that like the partisan, Right. So, well, one interesting thing is the effect of partisanship on the effect of partisanship on the receipt of this information compared between the three countries is kind of interesting. So obviously in the US, there's been an enormous amount of partisan COVID denialism. Has been a huge feature of the election of the last 6 months. In India, there is COVID denialism, but the partisan split is more along the lines of who should be to blame for the spread of COVID. So that lots of the BJP, lots of BJP sympathisers have been suggesting that certain immigrant populations are somehow to blame for the spread of the pandemic, and obviously the opposition parties are trying to land blame at the door of the government. So yeah, there's interesting differences in the partisan splits, the way the information has been received, and I guess I'm not sure if there's a broad lesson we can take from this, other than perhaps to say that the politicization of public health is more virulent now, and I think that probably has to do with the social media landscape more than anything, and just the structures of social media do intensify those kinds of epistemic vices, right? They make us more likely to be trapped in echo chambers. They make it more likely for us to only see information from a very narrow range of sources. So the lesson the lesson I would suggest is not that there's partisanship in public health communication. That's probably always been the case and will always be the case, but it's really important to see how technology has exacerbated this to a pretty dangerous degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Thank you, Al. That's very helpful. Starting to see engagement pick up on the chat, so thank you for those posting your questions. Keep them coming. Really keen to hear from you and what you'd like to hear from the panelists this morning. Anne-Marie, maybe if there's a point here which I'd like to broaden out from Rebecca around, we've spoken briefly in this conversation around sort of the need, or at least it feels like the need for people to be able to understand data and graphs and what exactly risk is in practice. And Rebecca here says that surely this all comes back to education. How about freeing up the school curriculum for simulating vast volumes of content to teach skills of analysis, to interpret data? Sort of a broader point, let's talk more about sort of what is the solution here. We don't obviously need everyone to be trained as statisticians, but how do you think we approach this question?
Well, I think a perfectly laudable suggestion, and I think it's what everyone said all year, isn't it? I'm not an epidemiologist, but, and then you've got the same view as Brian down the pub. Interpret, your take on the stats of the day or whatever. I've never done so much maths actually since I ceased at 16. In the last sort of 9 months, trying to make head nor tail of this as a part of what we do day to day for our bread and butter. And I think I think one of the challenges we've got is that the mainstream media in particular, never mind social media with its trappings and echo chambers, etc. I think the mainstream media is complicit. It seeks a headline. It seeks to tell you, gosh, the mutant algorithm, it will ruin your life kind of thing. Or it seeks to say the data has been stolen or hacked. It doesn't want to tell the story of this is how you interpret it. And I remember about 4 or 5 weeks ago that I won't mention the outlet concerned for fear, but they posted a massive graph on a Saturday morning full of lots of graphs on the front page, and everyone immediately was sending that up on social media saying, see, it's true, we don't need to worry at all, see, this thing doesn't hurt anyone. And it was just so dangerous, and I just felt like it's almost willful at that point, and it's life critical, it's life threatening to put that kind of information out. And it feels to me like there is a huge responsibility, not just on the social media platform operators, but also the mainstream media, to not always seek the obvious headline or to make matters worse. So I think there is an education, but there's almost not just to understand but to understand what the media is telling you and why. Mm-hmm. So you question it and put it in context.
I think a point on as education is, clearly important, and but it's whenever people suggest like changing the school curriculum as a solution to a problem which is current, I always wondered, like, that's a solution for the problems that we have 10 or 20 years from now. It's clear from the data that the people who have most trouble with misinformation online are older people who aren't going to be going to school, right? So this is outside my area of expertise, and it seems like something that Hera will probably have something to say about, like how do we get these communities involved in any kind of education that we might think is necessary.
Yeah, really interested to hear from you here on that point, particularly around the participation angle there. Would be fascinating to hear more about.
So I mean, when I was working in the open data space, I spent about 5 years doing monthly events with the general public, trying to get them to look at data sets when it came to like corporate data, and trying to find like links between companies and like investigating. For example, we mapped all of Donald Trump's like subsidiaries and its different like big corporate, where we looked at quite big companies like G4S. And even when it came to public contracts, doing that, getting people interested in it to see how, so that people can start seeing the links and see how corruption actually happens in the public and what it looks like. What was interesting from that is that it's really good and it really opens people's like minds. I think that's a good exercise. Like that investigative like talent needs to be built into schools, simply because we're going to be dealing with so much more disinformation and misinformation. I'm particularly worried about deep fakes, because I think that's like scary in terms of how realistic it can look. And I think in the future to prepare ourselves, definitely we need to change education. But I think when you talk about education, the basic thing is trust and like citizenship. I think teaching kids that I feel like sometimes there's this very toxic circle in the UK where no matter what position government takes, people are never happy with it, and I find that strange as a society, about like how do we build trust into systems. So if the government messes up, we kind of accept it or we challenge them, but we kind of take that accountability, but then don't write them off for long, which gives them more chance to kind of experiment or be honest. Which was a really good comment in the comment section about how honesty is important for communication. And the other way around is how the government holds itself accountable, and does things not because they'll be popular, but can also take the like difficult decisions. So I think what someone mentioned Taiwan approach to polarization of opinions, and the way Taiwan has sort of got around it, and they have a different society. So I think it's definitely something to keep in mind, is culture plays a big role in it. So they've built a lot of social tech like platforms that enable like healthy debate. They have a very like radically like honest style of government where straight up call out lies as lies, and will make memes about like common like COVID denial, any kind of like misinformation and things. They kind of make it uncool to believe them, and they use like basically the viralness in that way. So they have very strong like a connection of like civic leaders and people who will make this information spread. Whether that would work in the UK or not, I'm not sure, because I don't think we are even there yet in terms of like trusting any communication from the government. And I really think that this is a two-sided thing. It is not solely the responsibility of the government, and it's not solely the responsibility of citizens. There's like a deep fissure in between, and lots of communities. Like one of the biggest fears right now is because of the fact that a lot of the anti-vaccination myths that come from like migrant communities are rooted in things that have happened in the past. In my country of Pakistan, the only country in the world where polio is still an issue, and the reason why it's still an issue is because there's a history of foreign intelligence like pretending to be polio workers and then carrying out operations, which then makes people believe that this is so there's real like trauma behind some of that belief. And I think it's like repairing that trust is important by working with people in those communities and like helping them understand why this is so critical. And just like one last point on the communication, I think the most powerful thing I've seen in this entire period has been a piece from the Guardian, which I kind of mass forwarded to everyone, which had a visualization based on a study which showed how the virus spreads in in a restaurant, with windows open, with windows closed, people wearing masks, people not wearing masks. And that was the single most useful thing I have seen like come out, because it really showed people how airborne diseases work. Because yeah, I mean, I'm still like, it's just people just don't understand how it is. Like they'll take off their mask and then talk, and they'll lean into each other's faces, and they not understanding like how it's spreading is a big issue. So I think that was a fantastic job. Hats off to Guardian and the researchers that actually did that study.
Thank you, Hira. We'll keep an eye out for that and maybe tweet that later today. Thank you. It sounds like a very good visual representation there. Al, maybe if I can come on to you next. Obviously, during this conversation, we've spoken a lot about obviously misinformation and the sort of disinformation as well. And this was actually a key topic of conversation on our Democracy in the Age of AI closing plenary at yesterday's conference. Can you tell me a bit more about that? What kind of impact is this spread having on our democracy? But equally, what kind of tools and techniques are out there to help people spot cases of myth and disinformation?
Cool, thanks. Well, I think it's probably useful to start by addressing something Anne-Marie said right back at the beginning, which is like that the distinction between misinformation and disinformation is like there's a kind of toy definition that we use in the counter disinformation space, which is that misinformation is just any any untrue information. Disinformation is untrue information which has been designed to be misleading. But that isn't an especially useful distinction if you're trying to understand how misinformation affects the public or the public sphere. And he's also absolutely right that, or rather, I agree entirely that one of the largest problems with the way people understand the problem of misinformation in the public sphere today is that they believe that, or most people who are thinking about it believe that it is somebody else's problem. There's a perception that this kind of gets back to the education point as well. There's a perception that the problem of misinformation is down to poor media literacy, or down to or down to other kinds of like ignorance or stupidity, and it's just not the case. Like it's very easy to make a case that there have been instances of clear misinformation which was spread around, well-educated circles across the political spectrum. And it's incredibly important, I think, to understand that misinformation is everybody's problem, and it is a feature of the structures of the information ecosystem that we find ourselves in now. It's not something that we can simply educate our way out of. It's something that we, like, at the very least, need to design around, but probably involves a fundamental rethinking of the way that information and media works in the public sphere. Mm-hmm. So and if that sounds like a daunting task, it should. Sorry, I don't know if I can't even remember what the question was.
That is certainly answering it. So it was just looking at, and I think it's very helpful in these conversations to address and define the differences between mis and disinformation for those that don't know. But it was the sort of impact it has on democracy, and just also what, beyond maybe sort of the education piece, what are the tools or techniques that are out there that we maybe need to scale in order to address this issue?
So here's something that's interesting that we've been so there's been a complaint in civic society for decades that political participation is just dwindling to nothing. But if, as you should, see engagement on social media with any kind of like political news, even if it is misinformation or disinformation, it's still participation, right? You're just participating in the wrong stuff. So that like one important lesson I think that people who are concerned about civic participation should draw is that, also one thing I think is important for them to think about is that people do clearly have an interest in participating in civic society. They're just doing it in these really weird, unhealthy, unhelpful spaces. So we need to think carefully about why they're doing it there and not in the places that we think they should. And I think Hero is absolutely right that it comes down to trust and a fundamental kind of misunderstanding in the establishment of what politically useful trust looks like. I think there's way too much kind of inside currency given to traditional media outlets, to establishment organizations, and I think there's way too much emphasis put on the idea that these are like long-standing and establishment organizations, therefore they should be subject to trust. And maybe there are good reasons to trust long-established organizations. I certainly think there are, but it's a big difference between saying that these are traditional, good, established organizations with like strong internal processes and good accountability and whatever else, and the kind of trust which drives political activity of the kind that we see in like grassroots Facebook groups and whatever, which is a huge locus of a lot of problematic misinformation.
I just want to be controversial for a second. Well, sure. I want to do a correction. I credited The Guardian for that news story I was talking about. It's actually from El País, which is an amazing newspaper, and you should definitely follow their work. Excellent. So I've shared that link in the chat.
Thank you.
The controversial opinion I have is I also think a lot of people misunderstand freedom and freedom of speech, freedom of movement, like their rights as a citizen. They conflate that personal freedom with collective good. I think that is just, I feel like that is, if one thing has been clear to me in this pandemic, it is that there's something wrong in the way people understand this concept in Britain, because people in China, yes, they live under an authoritarian regime. People in Taiwan and Japan, they don't live in authoritarian regimes, but they were able to sacrifice with a lot less debate their personal right to go out for a walk or go to the pub, go to their families for Christmas, Easter, all of that stuff, because they knew it was temporary, and they just knew they had no choice. They had to do it. Mm-hmm. So even if it was an unpopular choice, that really radical, drastic step has helped those countries so much in the long term. So many less people dying. Their lockdowns being shorter. And I don't know, maybe this is an outsider perspective, but I just really feel, I really see in the way people discuss this, that there's so much focus on rather than thinking about, what about everybody else who, is more vulnerable than you.
So you're absolutely right that we've got a really peculiar conception of liberty in this country. But at the same time, I think that's a cultural quirk which is very apparent. And at the end of the day, when you're designing public health communication and public health policy, you have to design it around the citizenship.
Absolutely agree.
You have. And one of the most remarkable failures, I think, of various kinds of communication in the UK during this pandemic has been some just really obvious open goals, which people seem to have missed, and which have resulted in entirely foreseeable problems,
absolutely agree.
Like the whole Barnard Castle affair, and even this week with the vaccine rollout, right? So yesterday we had headlines about side effects. We knew side effects were there, were a possibility. We knew they would definitely happen. We also knew that people would use them to try and discredit the vaccine. So why haven't we had a weeks-long public health campaign talking about the fact that vaccines might have side effects, but that's not something that we should be worried about?
And existing side effects taken into account when you vaccinate your kids. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
there's always a chance, right? So it's not like something novel. And just talking about the fact that they can always happen. I think, and that sharing the probability of that is so important. I think Charlotte's put a comment in the chat about like, how do we talk to people who, you know, are afraid of the vaccine about the risks, but, you know, rather than throwing stats at them. I think one thing that I find useful is something I've learned from, you know, my family members who are in the NHS, and when I discuss this with them, because they hear this all the time from patients, is them saying, well, you know, you're already exposed to that risk because you've vaccinated against these things since you've been a kid. And look, because of that, you've not had this. These are the possible side effects that you could have if you didn't get it. So that has been really good. And also one small thing, I think, Al, you were right about the communication. I still am like dumbfounded at the fact that we still call it social distancing rather than using the word physical distancing, which would make so much more sense, because people don't understand that it's not meeting people that's the issue, is how close you stand to them and how you laugh into their mouth and hug them. That is the issue.
Yeah, good point. The kind of the words that we use obviously very, very important here. Anne-Marie, I'd like to just come back to you, particularly, you know, going back to which is around getting this right in 2021. Obviously, I think we all agree public engagement, particularly with the rollout of the vaccine now beginning to be rolled out. Do you think we need to change our approach to sort of public engagement looking ahead to next year? And if so, in what ways?
So big questions. Absolutely.
Big question.
Why not change it? Why not change it? Yeah, we need to work out what has worked well and be mindful that like using the social media platforms during the lockdown, for example, the work we've done, we've produced 4 reports actually for people shamelessly that want to go and plug there, go and read about what people said on social media about the pandemic amongst the social care and health workforce, but also in the general population. I think some things did work. People were really quick to support one another and to reach out and to offer solidarity, as it were, while they were isolated at home from one another. They were very quick to set up mental health initiatives and promote community initiatives and coming to drop things off for people at a more local level on some platforms. Another place we see the sort of kids' PE lesson that nearly killed half the parents in the country to keep up with, streamed online, you know, that people were all playing with. So I think there were things that promoted good health and cooperation and all the good stuff we've just sort of said it was missing in some respects from our kind of selfish. I think the selfish might have come partly as fatigue, I would say, on that. I think it's and I think what I would take away is that I'm astounded how impatient we are to wait for this to end in a sensible manner with science helping. So I think it's patience that is missing as much as there is some kind of individualism in the quirk of the culture. Looking forward, I think there's a bunch of things that I've noticed this year. The first is to make sure we don't lose people in the data. There are some people whom we simply don't know what happened to them. You can go and look at the LEADER report online that's been published recently and other related reports about people with learning disabilities. They were 6 times more likely to die in the first half of this year than we were. So in that case, you know, why that's an estimated number, because we don't know how to find people. So there are some people that are lost in the data, and I think we can't tell their story and find them and amplify their requirements, and they can't necessarily amplify their own. And I think it's really important that we remember that, and we have an ethical and a moral duty to them to make sound for and with. I think there's something around how we go forward and really like think through this idea of, is there any way to develop an algorithm that's not biased? But, you know, well, let's not dance on the head of a pin. But I think it's important that people understand the limits of such technologies as they're coming through, and that we insist on a standard. One of the ideas we've been thinking about recently is whether or not the NHS could be the gold standard for good health data and for good algorithms. And could export that brand and say, if it's got the quality assurance mark of the NHS on it, then what does that mean? A bit like countries of origin in the current trade negotiations that are ongoing. You know, it's not champagne unless it's made in a particular area. The data and the algorithm in health isn't good unless it's got the NHS stamp of approval. And I think that's a really encouraging prospect. So I think those are the areas that I think we're positive about. The last thing I'll say as a dystopian note, though, is that I think that we see at the moment 2 bills going through the House of Parliament. We see the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill, we see the Trade Bill. One of them isn't yet forward thinking enough, in my view, about making sure patient safety attaches to algorithmic tools in the health space. And I think that there's a risk that we have a scandal before long, that's something that's data driven in health, that's a device, instead of, we've had this year stories from the Cumberland Review about sodium valproate use and vaginal mesh for women who've been left in terrible pain. We don't want that to happen with data-driven technology in health. So I think we need to stand up and call proactively during the consultation the government issues next year for that to be done well. Balancing, obviously, the need to innovate and for enterprise to come up with the new treatments and technologies of tomorrow that we all want. I think in the trade bill, more importantly, and this morning I see the Secretary of State has announced we have a good deal, a new deal, a continuity deal or something with Singapore, which is great. But it also heralds the possibility next year, like a lot of the other continuity agreements, of new digital chapters. There are no votes on these meaningfully in the House at the moment within the bill's context. And I think if we want people to trust in the relationships we're forging in other parts of the world, as global Britain or whatever we're calling ourselves now, I think then we have to make sure that people understand what those digital chapters mean for them in a really concrete sense.
Mm-hmm. Two bills to very much keep an eye on as they progress through Parliament. And Anne-Marie, if you're able to, please do add a link to your 4 reports. I've had a look. They are brilliant reports. So if you post those in the chat, I'm sure others will be interested to read those. Here, I'd just like to come on to you, and I'm conscious we've got pretty time for maybe a couple more questions. But Anne-Marie, as part of her sort of answer there, was speaking about sort of gaps in data sets and sort of vulnerable individuals. Obviously, I know within the sort of line of work you're in, that's a kind of a key area and issue for you. What must be done to ensure that those that are vulnerable or at risk have the appropriate channels to raise their concerns, and what sort of work are you doing at Chain to make that happen?
Great question. I mean, there's a report this morning around the Greater Manchester Police and the fact that it was a failure to take account of 1 in 5 reports of crime, and most of them were to do with domestic abuse, harassment, stalking, coercive control. That's about 80,000 complaints in total in a year's time, and that's about 220 reports of crime every day. So that's huge. This is just for Greater Manchester. So, and the truth is that people only call the police mostly when things are really bad. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of pain that they've already gone through before they get to that stage. And there must be different avenues for people to reach out before that. So I think those multiple pathways, whether it's through your GP, whether it's through your school, must be present to get people to safety or to help them make up their mind about what's safe for them. And on the other side, I've seen a huge rush to for both the public services and charities to use more tech, which as a tech for good person, I'm really excited about, because I've always tried to convince them to do it. But I also am fearful because it's going in the wrong way. So for example, I was talking to someone who was saying, we've had so many people reaching out to us, so we're thinking I'm not gonna name the company here because I think they're part of this conference. So this company has offered us a free AI chatbot, and they're gonna talk to all the victims of domestic abuse for us. They're gonna talk to them, and it's just this Al chatbot, which was just AI chatbot, is gonna solve our issues, and we can focus on the cases that come to us face to face. And I was so blunt when I heard that. I was like, that is absolutely the wrong approach, because when someone's really vulnerable, you do not want them to be talking to a very dumb piece of code, because that cannot understand the intricacies of trauma. You can use that to direct them to your services or other people's services, but you absolutely cannot use them as a replacement for human support. And I think that choice of having a technology that's there has opportunity, and not using it for convenience, I think in this sort of way is so important, because that the drive is there. I think for anybody who's in public policy and is a fan of technology or is a technologist, really ask yourself, is this a good application of this tech? This is not passing a judgment on the tech, it's passing the judgment on the use of that. So it's does this fit this? If it doesn't fit this, how can I use it in a way? So we have a chatbot, but it literally just sends people a list of articles they can read, and it says that up front that I am not a human, do not expect chat from me. This is all I can do. So very important for us to keep these things in mind.
Yeah, beats, human conversation on those really important issues. So yeah, interesting. Al, I'd like to come to you now. Might be our only chance for sort of answering the final question for this plenary session, which is really looking at what are the key lessons and insights that we can take away with us for 2021 to ensure that citizens' voice are heard in the digital ethics debate?
Sure. Sorry, my mind is completely blown by the thing that Hira just told us about. I think if I think this is something this is something that's really important for like everyone in this room. Every organization has blind spots when it comes to technology, and you need to be like people need to be able. There needs to be systems and a venue in any organization for people to be able to say, hey, look, this is a really terrible idea, that like there are serious moral problems with this application of technology. And I think often in the tech space, the issue often is that there aren't systems or stages in the design process in place for people to give that kind of feedback. Because you hear an idea like that and you think, like, how did that get past the design phase? And probably it's because no one had an opportunity to have that discussion. So that was horrifying. Sorry, what was the question?
No, but I mean, it all relates. So what are the lessons learned? What do we take forward to 2021? How do we do things differently next year?
God, I mean, Anne-Marie's right. We will get stuck on the negative stuff. There was some really good things. Some people did very good things this year. It was very encouraging to see the level of kind of community solidarity that we had in the first 6 months. And I also think that we shouldn't expect people to be superheroes, right? As I said that previously, you got to work with the public that you have. It's completely reasonable to expect people to be fed up by this point. Like I'm not going to judge anyone too harshly for anything at this stage. Just if you're still saying you're doing great. But what do we do next year? I think because the problems that we've been able to complain about seem so obvious. So it's just a prayer, I guess, to just take more care with the like we're talking about data and participation and communication in this session. So just take more care with the communication in particular. Take more care with the way that you're using social media. In particular, be aware of the structures underlying. This is a point I've been hammering on, but be aware of the way that the structures of different social media platforms and social media as a whole shape your message and the effectiveness of your message. So don't expect don't expect to be able to post the same thing on Twitter and Facebook and put it in a newspaper and it have the same effect in each case, right? Design your messaging for the platforms design your messaging for the platforms you want to use, and target the platforms based on the communities that you want to reach. I mean, it's kind of it's simple stuff, but it's not been but fixing that fixes, I think, significant amounts of the problems that we've seen over the last few months.
Yeah, absolutely. So entering 2021, a bit more careful, a bit more considerate in our approach to these things. Excellent, thank you, Al. Anne-Marie, your parting words from us. What sort of key insights and issues do you think we need to sort of build on and take forward for 2021?
It's always that awful question, isn't it? At the end, I like what Al said. I think we should be positive. It's been quite a year, hasn't it, for everybody? And there's been some awful outcomes of that. So part of the awfulness was, I guess, back in April for us as an organisation, and for me personally, because of the research we've been involved in the last couple of years, was figuring out just how little we understood about care homes and people in receipt of care at home, and how we couldn't find them and immediately mobilise the system in the way we'd wanted. And I feel personally responsible, having tried to push that agenda for 2 years and say we need better data, not getting it right sooner and in time for an emergency. You do feel that some of the responsibility, I think. But the positive to come out the other side is that it is massively injected impetus to do something about it. And so I'm really looking forward in the new year, early in the new year, I hope, to the government's first National Health and Social Care Data Strategy, in which there will be recognition of the need to better understand social care and those people that are most vulnerable amongst us. So if it took a pandemic to do that, I'm sorry. And I think that it's awful. The good news from that is that we've set up a whole space, launched yesterday actually, on the social care community of practice for anyone who wants to play in analytics and link data sets and try and help people who are vulnerable and difficult to find. So again, via the website. But I think I'm sad that it's all this, but I take positive from the bad news that we found opportunities and found challenges that we're now going to address properly.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Brilliant. And finally, on to you, Hira. What are the issues that, or lessons learned from 2020 that we should be bringing into next year? And by the sounds of it, also, what's a reason to be cheerful as well, which I quite like the positive attitude of the last two speakers. So final word goes to you.
So much things to look forward to. With so much pain comes resilience. I think people have showed up in solidarity with each other, have reached out over political parties, have tried to work together. People have and really focused on local, and I think that's really something that we should focus on 2021 is how can we make our local towns, our areas vibrant for businesses, for homeless people, for those who are on who need help with food provision, all of those things that we have done on a temporary basis. How do we make it long lasting? And for all technologists, I would say, and public policy people, please make sure you design for hope, agency, solidarity, empathy, because we have an amazing chance to not continue doing business as usual and really use this year as a way to reflect on how we can be more honest, genuine, and engender trust in the people that we work with.
Excellent. Some great parting words there. Thank you very much, Hira. And thank you to my panelists, to Al, to Anne-Marie, to Hira, for a brilliant session. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. I could have spoken to you all for hours, but alas, we only have an hour. So thank you so much.